In 1990 in Japan, and in 1991 in the US, Nintendo entered the 16-bit market with their Super Nintendo console. Eager Punch-Out fans hoped for a new game in the franchise early on in the system's life. Unfortunately, fans would have to wait until 1994 to see the next incarnation, titled Super Punch-Out, when it was released in the US. In Japan, the title was released for Nintendo's Nintendo Power RAM cartridge. This cart was capable of storing a number of different games on one cart. Owners would bring their RAM cart to authorized retailers with a Nintendo RAM cart station, where they could download various games for the cart that were cheaper than buying the individual carts themselves. Super Punch-Out was again developed by Nintendo's R&D department, with series veteran Genyo Takeda serving as producer. Super Punch-Out is an interesting entry in the series, as the title tends to have more similarities to the original arcade series, rather than that of the NES title that came before it. In the NES Punch-Out, players took control of Little Mac, and in order to see your opponents, Little Mac was purposely created as a small sprite. This was due to compensate for the NES's inability to display the wireframe character of the arcade series. Super Punch-Out on the SNES in a way evolved the wireframe concept into a more solid though transparent fighter, while still retaining the basic gameplay of the original. Another change that was a throwback toward the arcade games was rather than having individual rounds, the game is just one big round. The player will fight until someone wins. Unlike the arcade game though, you have unlimited time, so there are no game-ending decisions. The heart system featured in the NES title was completely scrapped, which changed the gameplay again to a more familiar style than that of the arcade games. Because of this, the game wasn't as counter-based as its NES predecessor, and it added a bit more offensive strategy to the gameplay. The basic gameplay mechanics that the Punch-Out series is known for, however, remained unchanged. Dodging your opponent's attacks and waiting for the opening to strike was still key to success. However, there were some instances when a preemptive strike worked better. In most fights though, the dodging and reacting strategy still worked best. Super Punch-Out's controls also have some similarities to that of the arcade titles, as there are two planes of defense, the high and low defensive stances. The player by default is always in the low defensive stance, so in order to block body blows, the player doesn't need to move the controller at all. It is only when defending against head punches that the player needs to hold up on the controller pad to block. Ducking in the game was made easier than in previous entries, as the player only needs to hit down on the D-pad to do so. As in the NES title, by default the punching buttons will enable your boxer to throw body punches, while holding up and hitting punch buttons will land headshots. Ditching the star system from the NES Punch-Out, Super Punch-Out brought back the power punch meter from the arcade games that let the players build up power in order to land bigger punches. Having additional buttons on the SNES controller also made it easier to throw your power punch, as the button for it was assigned to the A button, rather than the select button as it was on the NES. This layout has a more natural feel to it, as it did on the arcade control panel. When your power meter is full, not only will you be able to throw a more powerful body blow and head punch, but pressing the power punch button repeatedly allows your fighter to throw a number of quicker, though less powerful power punches. In addition to the lower power punch meter, the background of your player's picture also changes color. When the background of your fighter's picture flashes, your fighter can throw normal punches with increased speed. This punch meter system added to the suspense, as well as gave the players a risk-reward mechanism into what is already a pretty deep game. One very helpful feature that's been added to the game is that when you knock your opponent down, you're able to press your punch buttons repeatedly to gain energy back. This definitely helps with the more difficult fighters later in the game. In the NES Punch-Out, players were given tips by their manager Doc Lewis in between rounds. Since Super Punch-Out moved away from the round system, the developers thought of another way to give the players tips by having speech bubbles from your opponent's manager be shown when your opponent is about to make a move. These tips were definitely helpful in helping players figure out some of the game's more eccentric fighters' moves. What is mostly seen as the biggest draw to this game was the title's roster. In the game, players were able to fight their way through 16 opponents on their way to the title. This is the biggest roster that has been featured in any Punch-Out game to date. Unlike the NES version, none of the fighters are repeated, so every fighter offers something completely different from the last, each with their own distinct style and look. Some Punch-Out veterans like Bear Hugger, Dragon Chan, Piston Hurricane, Mr. Sandman, Bald Bull, and Super Macho Man are included in the game. However, a slew of new characters never seen in any of the Punch-Out games were also included. Even the fighters that had returned from previous games were reimagined and fight quite a bit differently than they did in previous entries. Because of this, the game never feels like a retread of the past games. With the roster being so extensive, Nintendo decided to have 4 fighting circuits. This topped the game's predecessor, as the NES title only had 3. The player's fighter in the game was given a fresh new look and looked different than any previous fighter in the Punch-Out series. At the time of the game's release, no official name or information about the fighter was given. Since the game's release, however, Nintendo has gone on the record as saying the fighter's name is Mac from the previous NES game. But obviously he looks nothing like Little Mac from the NES, or even the modern Wii game. In early videos and screenshots of Super Punch-Out, the fighter did look like Little Mac. This can be seen in screenshots in Nintendo Power issue number 63, as well as a promotional video made early on in the game's development. Further evidence pointing out that the player's character is Mac can be found in EA's Fight Night Round 2 for the Nintendo GameCube. In this game, not only can you unlock the SNES Super Punch-Out game, but you can also unlock the Super Punch-Out's main character to be used in the actual Fight Night game. As you can see from this video, the character's name is shown as Mac. Everything that is important for a Punch-Out game is done well in Super Punch-Out. The gameplay was as solid as ever, it had an excellent art style, and sound effects really make you feel like you're in the action. To some, the music wasn't quite as memorable as the NES game, but it was definitely not bad in any way. While earlier Punch-Out titles had their own difficult portions in the game, Super Punch-Out tends to be more difficult than previous entries, specifically during the special circuit. It is because of the game's difficulty, though, that the game has a high replayability factor. The inclusion of a time attack mode also added some replayability, as well as tried to improve the time it takes them to defeat opponents. Because the game cartridge included an internal battery in it, players could save their times in addition to their progress in the primary title bout game. Super Punch-Out is a classic game that any fan of the series should definitely play. For a long time, it looked like Super Punch-Out would be the series' swan song, as years went by without even a hint of a new title in the series. Little did gamers know, however, some 15 years later, Nintendo had other plans for the Punch-Out franchise.